So I'd just like to say hello to everybody and welcome, and thank you for joining us for the first reading group session for the exhibition Gives on and With Decolonial Moves of the Transcultural, which is guest curated by Noor Bangu, and I will hand over to Noor in just a moment. And I would just like to acknowledge, first of all, that the All Gallery, where I'm speaking to you from and where the exhibition is sort of physically hosted, is in Vancouver, which is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And this is really great. And we had the little opening reception last week, and this is the, as I said, this is the first reading group session. So we're just kind of, the exhibition is starting to fill up. Zinnia's work will be installed directly after this group. And also the lights in the gallery will change color to sort of signal that shift. So yeah, this is a great way to kind of kick off. So I'll hand it over to Noor.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see familiar faces. And yeah, I'm super excited for Zinnia to kick off our program. Before I sort of introduce the exhibition and Zinnia as well, I just want to ask folks if we can continue recording, because this is also part of the exhibition. The documentation will go live. And if you're not comfortable, maybe you could turn off your mic or your videos. Does that seem okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, I'll briefly outline the exhibition. So yeah, my name is Noor Pangu, and I'm curating this exhibition, which is taking shape as a reading session, as a series of reading sessions, featuring artists and a research collective from Canada and Norway. And I'm currently speaking to you from Norway, so it's pretty late post dinner, but I'm really excited for this conversation. And the exhibition is quite loose at this point. My aim in bringing these artists together is to just really continue working with them and spending time with them over the coming weeks, and maybe thinking about what decolonization means in our curatorial and artist practices, and yeah, how we can do this work through research, conversations, and also circulation. So yeah, I'm really excited, and I want to introduce Zinnia Naqvi, who is an interdisciplinary artist based in Georgia, Montreal, and Toronto, Toronto. Her work examines issues of colonialism, cultural translation, language, and gender through the use of photography, video, writing, and archival material. Recent works have included archival and restaged images, experimental documentary films, video installations, graphic design, and elaborate still lives. Her work often invites the viewer to question her process and working methods. So it's great to be part of this process with you. And yeah, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, yes. Thanks everyone for coming today. And thank you so much, Noor Bangu, for inviting me to be a part of this exhibition. It's been so nice talking through sort of ideas and works with you always. And thanks so much to Lori White and Denise Reiner for helping us facilitate and hosting us at Our Gallery. Yeah, it's been nice to work on things with all of you, even though we're across multiple time zones. Yeah, so I'd like to say my own land acknowledgement as well, because I'm currently living and working on the lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. These lands have been nurtured by a diverse group of people with distinct customs, languages, beliefs, and traditions. And as a settler immigrant myself, I recognize my own position in contributing to the colonial project of so-called Canada, and that's something I aim to address in my work and practice. Also kind of wanted to acknowledge the program that we're using together. Zoom has its headquarters in what's now called San Jose, California, which are the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamien peoples. Most likely the Zoom servers that we're being hosted on, the Equinix servers are located all around the world, but most likely I'm assuming that the servers we're using are based in Toronto, Toronto. Which is also where I'm from. I grew up in that area, which is the ancestral lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of those lands. So yeah, I wanted to thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to be discussing the two readings by Ken Lum that we sent out, Something's Missing and Canadian Cultural Policy, A Problem of Metaphysics. I'm also going to be showing some of my work and work in progress and discussing that with all of you today. Since we're sort of, I think, like a manageable size group, which is perfect, it might be nice to quickly go around and say names and pronouns if you're all comfortable with that. If you don't want to, that's totally fine. You can, feel free to skip. Either you can, I guess I'll start by picking somebody. I can also go around and just tag people. That might be the easiest way to go. So maybe I'll start with Paul.
Sorry, hi. My name is Paul, and I use he, him pronouns. Is that good? Do you need anything else?
No, that's all. I just want, yeah, everyone to say hi if you're comfortable. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for coming. Yeah. Simran, I'm just gonna go through my order to make it fast. So Simran, if you wanna, Simran, please.
Yeah, my name is Simranpreet. I go by she and her pronouns.
Thanks. Devani.
Hi, my name is Devani. I use she, her pronouns. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Abidar.
Hi, my name is Abidar, she, her, here from Hamilton, Ontario.
Thank you. Preeti.
Hi, I'm Preeti. She, her are my pronouns.
Thanks for coming. Pamela. If you can, if you're able to chat. Oh no, sorry. Or yeah. Okay, no problem. Alize.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I'm Alize. I use she, her, they, them pronouns.
Cool. No problem. Thanks for coming. Sarah, if you're there, she might be busy. We'll keep going. Pardis, if you want to say hi. Layla, if you, okay, great.
Hi, she's Pardis. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks. And Layla, if you're there, if you want to say hi, but no pressure.
Hi, I'm Layla and I use she, her pronouns.
Amazing. Thanks so much, everybody. Okay, so I wanted to start off with acknowledging also our positions in gathering over Zoom and what that kind of means while we're trying to navigate multiple screens and different parts of our lives and work. And probably some of you are working or handling, taking care of loved ones, taking care of babies, families, all that thing. So I also want to thank you for taking the time out of your days to join us and chat with us today. So I wanted to start off with a writing exercise. I'm a member of Amelia Maya, which is an intergenerational feminist working group. And as I was kind of preparing for the talk today, I was going through, so we published, I think last year, a collection of chapbooks, which are kind of a compilation of different sessions that we've been holding since 2016 at various places across Toronto, sometimes some in public, some in private. And the last one of our chapbooks is the workbook, where we kind of go through all of the sessions that were held and have lay out the different prompts that were held. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was reading it over and trying to get some ideas of just how to kind of break, I don't know, just think about our bodies in relation to the screen. And I came across this prompt that I wanted to try. So if you will humor me and take out something to write with, it can be a Word doc, or it can be a pen and paper, whatever you choose. And I'll start a little timer. So I will start off with you. I'll set a 2-minute timer. And if you could write for 2 minutes about the current position of your left foot. And I'm gonna start the timer, 1 sec.
Hi guys, sorry, I was in class.
No problem. Thanks, Pamela. Thanks for coming.
Hi, my pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm in Toronto. And I love you all. Bye. I mean, yeah, let's do it.
Thank you. Yeah, so, okay, I'm gonna set the timer for 2 minutes, and if you wanna start writing. Okay, and so the next prompt, I'm going to restart the timer. And I'd like you to write for 2 minutes about the current position of your smartphone, wherever it is. If you have a smartphone, assuming, or your phone or cell phone. Okay, so there's 15 more seconds. Okay, so thanks for taking part in that with me. The reason I wanted to start off with a writing prompt like that is to acknowledge the position of our bodies as well in relation to the way that we're communicating with each other. So the idea of writing about the position of your foot, I mean, I can share my response is that my foot is under my desk, which is under my laptop, the computer that I'm using to speak to you all and conduct this workshop. It's also sort of tingly and cold because I'm nervous and maybe it's too cold in my office. And, you know, this is a space where I do all of my work, which is my artwork. Yeah, I kind of spend so much time in this particular spot, and it's a place where I'm doing, you know, I guess labor that's maybe in a more traditional sense, but also leisure. And I don't know if we, you know, consider what we're doing together labor or leisure, but it's I just kind of wanted to acknowledge what it's taking for everyone to take time out of their day to be here to think together. And again, with the smartphone, it's, you know, thinking about the technology that we're using to also be here together and speak to one another, but also our, you know, mixed relationship, the dependency on it, and also how we're using it to communicate with one another. So just kind of a gesture and thinking about that, and also just kind of centering where we are when we're speaking to one another. So I don't know if anybody, maybe I'll just ask like one person if they want to share something about what they wrote.
I'll share something.
Cool.
I have my left foot perched on the base of my chair, which for some reason keeps my chair from rolling across the room. So it's just my sitting stance at my desk.
That's awesome. And your phone?
Oh, it's right beside me. Yeah.
Is that a good spot or a bad spot?
I don't know. It's right there. It's always right there beside my computer, right in front of me on the desk.
Yeah, I go through moments in my day where it's like either right now, obviously it's next to me because I was keeping time and I was like getting BBC News alert apps as I was talking to you all. But also where I like try to keep it in other parts of the house because I don't want to look at it. Or sometimes I'll put it next to my cat and then, you know, it's like, okay, break time, pet the cat, look at the phone. So, so it's like different parts of my apartment depending on what kind of day I'm having. Yeah, okay, thanks for sharing, Elise. So if nobody else is burning to share, I will go into the more formal part of the discussion. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. So this is a GIF I made, might take a minute to come up. I also like, yeah, and so I'm thinking a lot about screen culture and the screen because this is how I'm making work right now, or trying to make work. I mean, I haven't really started making the work, but this is like my medium. And I am a photo-based artist and I spend a lot of time with photography. I spend a lot of time working with screens. But that was actually sort of something I was trying to move away from a little bit in the recent past. But I recently, because of the pandemic, realized that maybe it's a good time for me to come back to the screen and use that as a way of working. But I'm thinking about all the different ways that it can be used. So I made this GIF in After Effects because I'm trying to learn After Effects. And that's like another skill that I'm trying to get and use this time to think about these things. So that's also another reason that I wanted to do the writing prompt, to just like think about all of these kind of constraints that we're forced to work through in this current moment. So what I asked you all to read with me today was Ken Lum's 2 essays from his new book, which I also have, which came out, I believe, in this past summer. Everything is Relevant. So Ken Lum, I imagine a lot of you are familiar with his work, but he's a Chinese Canadian artist who grew up in Vancouver and attended UBC. I also recently found out that he was one of the sort of like founding or directors of Or Gallery. So I thought, as I was just telling Denise, I didn't actually know that until this week when I was doing a little bit of research. But it seemed fitting just because Or is set in Vancouver and because he is such an influence to talk about his writing in relation to this workshop. So And I came across Ken's book because I just graduated from Concordia, and Concordia University Press put out this book. And by the way, they also, if you were interested in the readings that you read and you wanted to buy the hard copy of the book, they've given us a discount code. So please take advantage of that if you're interested in it. You can also, if you have academic access, I think you can download the whole thing for free on JSTOR, which I did initially, but then I kind of realized that it was the kind of book that I wanted to have in hard copy, because I am also an artist and photographer, and I have recently wrote a compilation of writings, and I use writing in my practice to kind of, or in my recent work, as a way to kind of justify a lot of impulses that I'm making. You know, I'm doing a lot of research when I'm making new work anyway, and it's a way for me to kind of articulate these connections and putting things together. And it seemed for Lum, I was listening to a talk of his recently, that it's a similar sort of impulse for him, is that's what he uses writing for. And he, you know, talked about how he has many different interests, and he doesn't think that writing is like a very exceptional thing, but it's just something that, not necessarily an extension of his practice, but something that he just does. And he's been doing it for the past 30 years. And, you know, in the book, he talks about how he used to go to the libraries at the VEG, at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and read a lot of art forums and different magazines there. You know, that's kind of how he learned about art, because he originally studied science and came into it later on. So I thought it would be a compelling text to talk about today. And also, sort of in relation to the two texts that I chose, Canadian Cultural Policy, A Problem of Metaphysics, and Something's Missing, I was also thinking about this idea of returning to certain subjects, because I read Ken's book after, or I started reading it after I had written my compilations of writing. So maybe I'll just show you. I have some. So this is one of his, you know, he's a photo conceptualist, works a lot with text as an art form as well. Oh yeah, okay, I'm kind of skipping around again. I'm going to talk about this too. Yeah, so I came across Ken's book after I had written my compilation of writings, which is a series of personal essays. And a lot of the things that Ken is talking about in relation to identity and multiculturalism and sort of making art in Canada are things that I was thinking about, and I had already kind of touched on in some of my writing as well. But to see, you know, this essay, the cultural Canadian Cultural Policy, A Problem of Metaphysics, that was published in 1999, you know, 20 years ago, and to see how a lot of these issues of, you know, decolonizing institutions and identity, the same conversations were happening 20, 30 years ago. And it's interesting to see kind of how change has come around so slowly. And that's actually what I also wanted to put an image of Pamela's exhibition in there, because I remember, Pam, when I came to your show at A-Space in 2019, and that was also kind of an awakening moment too, because, you know, you graciously included one of my text pieces in the show, but also kind of realizing just the importance of these cycles and these people who have come before, younger artists like me, who are having the same conversations 20, 30 years ago. And I think when you are a younger kind of emerging artist, you don't realize how long the struggle has been going on, and these cycles of conversations. And so that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me, actually, when I saw your show and the film. I don't know if you want to mention something really briefly. Do you want to pipe in?
Thank you. I'm honored and humbled that you shared some of your deep thoughts about it. And yeah, I'm still learning new things all the time. I don't think I really, even though I took a year to produce this show, it was kind of crunched out in 8 months, and I still am trying to make sense of a lot of what I've done. It's probably a visual testament to my practice as someone who's worked in Toronto and labored in Toronto artist-run culture for 26, 27 years now. And yeah, I'm still thinking through it. And I'm also trying to put my thoughts on paper about it, Zinnia. So I'm really appreciative that you're saying this. And writing doesn't come easy to me, as you can imagine, for people who are in the visual arts sector. But yeah, I think it was the quote, something that Jamili says in the excerpt that I took from a talk at the EGO with her and Homi Baba and Monica Kim Gagnon, in which every generation walks the steps of the past generations, and we don't seem to even think one iota of that path that we're traversing, that it's actually been a well-worn path. So thank you for mentioning that.
No, thank you. And I mean, I think this process of having these conversations is so important. And yeah, like I said, it was an eye-opening moment for me. And I also thinking about all of the scholars who've written about this. I was recently I tuned into a Zoom conversation between Monica King Gagnon and Richard Fung, in which they were discussing, their text, More Other Conundrums. And I think it was like the 20th anniversary of that book as well. And that was one of the questions that came up, is just thinking about like, I guess that was actually one of the questions I asked them, was like, are we kind of doomed to like be inching forward so slowly, is when sometimes it feels like change is not coming, but it's just like very incremental. And I guess it takes these conversations and path walkings to kind of get somewhere.
Yeah. Just keep on keeping on, guys.
Yeah. Keep on trekking.
Keep on trekking.
Like a very quick comment as well, like reading Ken Lum's work from like 1999 and 2006, and really understanding wanting to understand the sort of landscape and environments that he was critiquing. It was also interesting, like the shift in like citational practices, how you're looking to Ken Lum, but at that time he was like looking to Walter Benjamin, Heidegger, and only briefly mentioning like Buisson and Fanon. So like, even though we're like inching very slowly, I do think it's interesting how citational practices are changing though.
For sure, yeah. And I guess for me, like I always am drawn to like the memoir and the more like personal and like journalistic style of writing. And he very much was doing that. Like that's always a lot more enticing for me. And he has some full on just like journals in the book that's really just like interesting for me to read. Also just like about another artist's trajectory. So I guess that also brings me to I'll talk a bit about my work in a minute. But this is also part of my practice, and I know part of the exhibition as well, as thinking about citation and thinking about all of these, how text can come to influence our practice, but also it's also about conversation. I guess that's what I like about the book, is that it's very much kind of, some of it's just his raw thoughts, his journals, and it's like really just kind of nice to read that and read about, especially someone who's had such a long career and is still making. So I have kind of 3 sections of the text that I want to focus on. I'm going to start off with talking about the like legacy of multiculturalism, talking about first and third world and cultural production in Canada. So this is one of the first quotes that I pulled up here. So in this essay, Lum takes a close look at the optics of Canadian cultural policy. He talks about the Massey Commission, and he asks how to construct an identity for a nation that was comprised of isolated regions of diverse histories, and to which the threat of American influence was always present. So he's talking about kind of this, the policy of multiculturalism, and describing it as, I guess many of us know, that it was kind of seen as this antidote to the more assimilative approach of the American melting pot, which encouraged a lot of people to adopt the same values and, you know, become American or adopt an American identity, whereas the, you know, Trudeau government with their multiculturalism policy was about pushing forward individuality and individual cultures and then making a mosaic and all of these things. But his critique here is that while that is what was encouraged in practicality, A, that it's not that different, the two approaches, the melting pot and multiculturalism, and B, it's still the white European culture that tends to hold the most value or still be seen as like sort of the most Canadian, and everything else is being othered. And so I was thinking about this in relation to a lot of my work, which I'll go into, but I kind of wanted to ask, I guess, the group about what the legacy of multiculturalism is for you, if a couple people want to pipe in, because like for me, I grew up in Pickering, Ontario, which is a suburb of Toronto. It was a super diverse suburb. It was full of, you know, new immigrants from all over. I didn't really feel like a minority when I was living there until I kind of left high school and went to university. And I have very distinct memories of being like in second grade, and the project was to do a presentation about where you're from. And that was like part of the curriculum. But of course, the question of Indigenous history and peoples was never on the table. I didn't really understand that history until much later. Till I've honestly didn't really, I think, learn properly about residential schools until I was in university. So for my family and for my parents, I felt like coming to Canada, especially from Pakistan, where they were leaving a lot of instability and violence and things like that. It was kind of this almost like a utopia where everybody could come and live together in harmony and that kind of thing. And so for me, like my memory of multiculturalism was a very positive thing. But I think like through understanding it more as I'm, you know, looking more into these things and making work about it, I think it definitely has a negative connotation now. So I kind of, yeah, I wanted to ask if anybody wants to pipe in, like what the legacy of multiculturalism is for you, or what that like brings up for you, the term.
I can speak, I think. I feel like thinking about an older generation, like my parents' generation, or their kind of like the people who were around when these kind of multiculturalism policies were being put into place, have a very different understanding of what Canadian multiculturalism is. And I think like at around that time, multiculturalism, while like in theory is supposed to be this like good thing, was also like this really assimilationist thing. And so it became like fitting into Canadian society. And also that like there's something kind of insidious about words like multiculturalism or like diversity in terms of their erasure of things like racism, and like putting a positive spin on working through issues of diversity. And then also like how the word diversity or even multiculturalism like flattens a lot of difference over time. So like, I don't know, even words like BIPOC, where it's like Black, Indigenous, and POC are all put into one category rather than like the vast differences between the experience of someone that's like a person of color like me, or like an Indigenous person who has experienced and like continues to experience like the colonial legacies of the Canadian state.
Yeah, thanks, Simran. I feel like, is it okay if I call you Simran or Simranpreet? Do you prefer the whole Simranpreet?
I prefer Simranpreet, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I feel like what you're also tapping into is like the conundrum of language, like the problem with language. Because I guess that's also kind of what I'm interested to, and I guess that's something that might come up in this talk, is like, yeah, these terms, they maybe start off with one meaning and then become co-opted, or yeah, like even the idea of BIPOC is like meant to kind of be inclusive, but then it's all still like othering people, you know, like it's putting together a vast group of people that have very different experiences. And so, yeah, I guess like that's something that will come up again and again, is like the kind of failing of language to describe also the conundrum that we're in. And I feel like multiculturalism has a similar connotation in that way. Yeah, Devani?
Yeah, maybe I could add a point or two, but also I think both of what you said was really well articulated, so I'm not sure I'll be as eloquent. But on your first question, I think I had similar experiences as you, Zinnia. Like I grew up in a suburb in Mississauga. It was like a predominantly South Asian neighborhood, and really grew up with that rhetoric of multiculturalism being a positive thing. But I think what was interesting to me was how even in a space in which most people were, say, like majority South Asian, that there was so much internalized racism and xenophobia. Like I remember, even though my class was probably like 90% South Asian, when we had like a student who had just arrived from India, my classmates used to bully her for her accent and for the food that she used to bring, which I now looking back on it seems bizarre, but then I'm like, no, it isn't, because it makes sense that like whiteness or internalized racism would infect a space, even if it's supposed to be this mosaic or part of this like multicultural tapestry. So I think that's like the first time like I knew that there was like a failing of multiculturalism. But I think in our school, luckily too, when I was in middle school, we learned about residential schools actually when I was probably about 10 or 11, which I guess now looking back, hearing what you said, that maybe wasn't something that other people learned about. But I think I'm interested in that idea of language and co-optation as well, because I think what Simanpreet said was right, that I think multiculturalism also as a word has been heavily criticized, and the ideology has been criticized, but I've noticed that when people use the word diversity, it's not that different from how they were talking about multiculturalism. So I'm interested in how there's that shift, and now, you know, there's also more critical backlash against the ways in which diversity is used. And I also, when I think about co-optation, I think about how identity politics have sort of been co-opted and mutated from a much more radical origin orientation towards what they are now. And so I'm interested too in that shift in rhetoric or language, but then also the failing of language to want to capture the things that we do, but also with working in archives and like researching, it's always interesting to notice like the gaps in language, or how people were using certain terminologies or words that now I would think, oh, that sounds odd, or that's now become a derogatory term. Like even the term third world used to be a signal of solidarity, of like political struggle between newly decolonized countries in Asia and Africa. And it became, by the 90s, like post globalization and a new iteration of neoliberalism, it became a very derogatory term. So I'm interested in that too. Sorry, that was so much rambling. I apologize.
No, it was great. And I'm actually going to touch on some of that very soon. So I'm not going to comment directly on your comment just yet, but I'm going to bring some of it up. But I saw some hands, Pam, and I don't know if somebody else.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that these are not our terms. They weren't definitions that were developed on our terms. When I mean "our" is not the state, you know, these are state-derived terms: multiculturalism, diversity, you know, and even the hidden agenda of gentrification is to erase. Mm-hmm. You know, when you look at how like massive global cities now are, like, through this pandemic, they're one of the big things that people are remarking on, and I don't think there's really a lot of illumination on it, but how cities are just vastly changing. you know.
Yeah.
So they've become otherized in other ways, you know. So the mapping or the unmapping now of cities, and how there's like mass like people are just leaving cities, right? There's like a mass exodus now to like beyond the Greater Toronto area here. Sorry, I'm based in Toronto, so I'm just going to refer to what's happening. And I was just talking to somebody who was practicing architect and then just couldn't make it in that field and is now in architecture. And he was remarking how Toronto is rapidly changing. Even he goes between New York and Toronto in like real estate for business sector, and he was just saying how we are rapidly changing. And with that change comes a lot of the, like, you know, loss and the residual value of change, like of actual physical change, not just the material change.
Absolutely. And I think what you said in the beginning too, that this is not our language. And actually,
It
that's a
isn't.
really important point because, yeah, this is state language. But I also find that, you know, something else that's happening is sometimes when language of like activism, for example, and community solidarity becomes co-opted by the state. You know, like the opposite can like it just depends the way that we use them in different settings, but sometimes that is something I also see happening a lot as well. And that also can kind of change the way that we feel towards that term when the you know, intention of it is changed by the state or by the body that is using it then. So that's something I wanted to touch on. Abidar and Paul. Abidar, I guess, if you want to start.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what Pamela was saying and what Devani was saying around, like, I had a similar experience in high school where I grew up in Scarborough, and almost like, you know, probably 95% of people in my high school were first generation immigrants, racialized. And there was this really interesting dynamic where if you were white, you were automatically popular. Which is like, you know, I really didn't think about it in terms of race when I was in high school, but looking back on it now, like there was really interesting like power dynamics, social power dynamics and racial power dynamics playing out in this like teen setting. So I wonder, you know, like when we're talking about policy of multiculturalism, I think it's so true that there, you know, there might have been one intention, but the power imbalances are still there. And I keep thinking about this text that Ronaldo Walcott wrote, I think in the late 2000s, and he's like thinking about the ways in which Stuart Hall talks about creolization, and he's talking about how, like he's talking about an interest in a form of multiculturalism that's actually grassroots and on like the people level. That's happening in Toronto specifically, as opposed to like the state-led version of that, which is very like restricted and singular and one-dimensional. And I guess I'm like, this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, but I think it's relevant in the context of this session in terms of like, you know, even like this particular group of like, you know, a lot of us are racialized people kind of coming together to talk about these things. We're not racially homogenous, but like these kind of like solidarities that emerge more organically amongst communities, I think as maybe an aspect of a grassroots multiculturalism is really interesting. But I really struggle with like this, the policy of multiculturalism as this like framework and umbrella that we are all supposed to exist under, which just doesn't, it's not effective.
For sure. Yeah, thanks, Abidar. And Paul, if you want to type in. I'm just also realizing like we're almost at an hour and I'm not even a third into all the stuff I wanted to talk about. So maybe if you don't mind, I'll just ask Paul to comment and then I'm going to move to my next subject, but a lot of it's relevant. So also Lori, like, let me know if we have a time cut. Okay, Paul, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll keep it short as well. Yeah, I think everything everyone said so far has been really interesting. And like I come from a like French Canadian white perspective, which is really different. And I think is kind of interesting in this case because it's but like it is my language in a certain way, you know? Like Pamela was saying that it isn't the language that everyone chooses. And I like in my experience at least, it was kind of I realize now like a tool of creation in a certain way. Like it was the kind of linguistic tool that like we use to choose what got hidden and what got revealed in a certain way, or what got buried and kind of, or and what got excavated, and this maybe is a better way of phrasing it. And I can think of kind of like even the way like race functioned in my primary school was kind of almost erased, and it was kind of changed to like a linguistic identity instead. And I remember thinking of myself as or being like race blind or something in primary school, and now realizing like how kind of problematic that is rather. And yeah, like the way that identity was constructed was completely different. Like race had been kind of buried, and then like linguistic identity would be brought to the fore. And this was our idea of multiculturalism. It's like all of a sudden like we found like our place, we found our voice, like we're being heard and kind of identified, but that came at the cost of like refusing someone else's identity. So now I can see this multicultural ideals kind of contingent and yeah, like servicing a certain agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point as well. And I guess I was also thinking about that with what Pam said about this not being our language is like, yeah, a lot of this stuff has been, you know, translated into English, and that makes it, you know, we're all sort of supposed to be reading it from that lens, and that doesn't fit for everyone. And obviously in Quebec, there's a whole different, you know, political policy in relation to that. So that's another layer as well into the understanding of how people are supposed to be fitting in. Okay, so I'm going to move to my next. Well, I want to talk a little bit about my past work, I guess, in relation to this, but I'll keep it pretty brief. So a lot of my practice is in relation, or I work with the family archive. So this is some of my very early work. And I also kind of wanted to relate it back to this idea of multiculturalism in the arts being kind of, you know, because you're supposed to be embracing where you're from and your own language and things like that. But for me, also going into like arts education, this also meant performing other and performing my identity, but also performing like migratory history and things like that. So that's something that I was interested. Well, I don't know if I also kind of battle with this sometimes in my work. Is so like, was that something that I was interested in from the get-go, or was that something I was like encouraged to do because that was what I was encouraged to do in school? So I kind of wanted to just show you, I'm not going to go into it very much, but these are some of my very early work in which I'm diving into my family archive and thinking about the migratory patterns and history of my own family, and my parents and my paternal grandparents and things like that. And I later extended this into my community. So I made this project Past and Present, in which I sought out people from a lot of the subjects are people I went to high school with or were in university with, and made different pairings. So I would seek out an image from the family album from a person who was a new migrant to Canada, and then I would take a photo of their son or daughter who was first generation Canadian, and I would have them in domestic spaces to kind of understand this creation of a new home in a new place. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going super fast here. And later on in my work, I kind of also was doing this classic, I think, young artist thing where you try to go back to where you're from and understand your culture And yeah, that's something that I was thinking about and preoccupied by in a lot of my early work. And I kind of feel like this, I guess I think about it a lot, is this state-sponsored language being a result of these early explorations. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but that's something I just think about a lot. And that's something I try to kind of re-examine in some of my newer work. So some of my newer work, so this is a newer photograph in which I'm still working with the family album, but I'm looking at images. Oh God, sorry, going too fast. My mouse is too happy. From my family when they came to Canada as tourists, and I'm looking at images of them exploring Canada actually, and then questioning what it is to be a Canadian citizen, but also the ideals of Canadian citizenship that we are supposed to get from these specific tourist sites, and then pairing that with research and different materials. So that's something I'm more trying to address now in my current work, is like my actual position as like first generation Canadian, and questioning or like exploring more about where I actually am rather than thinking about the past so much. So I wanted to pop some of that in there. And so to go back to Lem's text, I wanted to think about actually something that Devani spoke about directly, was this concept of first and third world. And I actually wanted to touch on that directly because I found it very interesting in this excerpt of the Lem text, where he says that quite directly. He talks about how Canadian intellectuals have traditionally worked in concert with the national government to formulate an intermediary position for Canada between left and right ideologies, first and third worlds, which I found really strange because for me, you know, Canada has never been anything other than a first world country in my head. And even like, you know, if you look back at the sort of NATO definition of first and third world, it was originally conceived as, actually when I looked it up, it was originally countries that were aligned with NATO were considered first world, so like the US and Canada, and then countries and Great Britain, and then countries, the second world was kind of countries that were aligned with the USSR. And then third world were all the countries that were did not have any allegiance. And then that sort of concept changed. And now we think about it more as developing nations throughout the world. But I feel like, again, this was a definition that for me was very, very clear growing up. I grew up again like post 9/11, and my family's from Pakistan, and I had a very clear sort of visual understanding of what the third world was and what the first world was. And I knew, and I was really embarrassed and really sort of ashamed to be from a third world country, because I was really embarrassed at the amount of sort of visible poverty that I would see when I would go to Pakistan. And that was a very stark contrast for me, but that's something that I've noticed recently has become like terms that are used less and less. And I feel like those boundaries are becoming a lot more messy and a lot more unclear. And even, you know, I think like even, you know, we're kind of seeing it also in the aftermath or in the current circumstance that we're in, and thinking about COVID and thinking about just the way the world is developing. And like I pulled this tweet from the insurrection at the White House, and you know, the fact that so many people in the media kept being like, this is something we expect in Latin America or in the Middle East, this is not something you see in the US. And I felt like that language was really interesting but really offensive, and it really pissed me off because yeah, of course, like, you know, how is that a defense for what's happening? And this has been happening for, you know, white supremacy has been well alive for quite a while. And this idea that this is not something that can happen here, I mean, it is an awakening, I guess, for a lot of people, but I just feel like those borders between these two sort of imaginary types of places have become very muddied in recent times. So I wanted to, yeah, think about that again in relation to language and why we, you know, don't use these terms as much anymore. I'm not sure if anybody has any thoughts about that, about why we may or may not be using these kinds of terms currently.
I think Bhavna really kind of perfectly summarized like the kind of collapse of like the utopia of third world energy, that there's so much interesting work being done there, but also coming out of there during like the post-colonial era. And then it just sort of like, like the aesthetics were taken back to the first world, and the energy in a way collapsed in a way. But yeah, in our conversations, we also started talking about the fourth world, which is a term I think that Ella Shohat and Robert Stam originally used to talk about Indigenous communities in, first world situations. So like in Canada as well, and how that like, just like the knowledge of the fourth world collapses these categories that sort of try to, distinguish one place from another, which is really interesting. But yeah, talking about this, I'm also wondering, Zinnia, if you can maybe talk about when you were part of the Karachi Biennial, and maybe like how your work sort of translated from Canada back to Pakistan, or like, and then back again. So maybe what that movement was like.
Sorry, what the movement was like?
The movement was like, because Kenlam touched on like this biennial sort of energy as well. So I was thinking maybe we could ask you about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I know it was really nice to read about him too, and the way that different works are interpreted in different places. For me, it was a very, I guess I was nervous, but it was a very gratifying experience to show work in Karachi. And yeah, because you don't always know, like, especially when you're making work that is about a homeland, it won't necessarily translate to that place. And for me, I was pretty intentional about what work I showed. So I think what was actually more telling, I did an artist talk for a class there at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture, and I showed two of my projects. So Dear Nani, which is about photos of my grandmother pre-partition, and then Sea View, which is a film that I made in Karachi that's kind of about going home and understanding and confronting a culture that I don't really relate to. I think people really related to Dear Nani, and they were supportive in the way I had approached that project, and I was really happy about that. That was really gratifying for me to hear. But with Sea View, they didn't really get it as much, because that's more of a project. I think that project is really about being a diasporic person. So they kind of like didn't really understand what I was trying to fixate on in that way, because it's very much about translation. So I think it kind of depends on the work, but it was a really, like, I think it was a very gratifying experience to also go back to Pakistan and be able to kind of interact with the arts community as an equal also, and as a community member. So that was really exciting.
Like when we talked about it, I think 2 years, like maybe a year ago, time flies. But I think like I was at that moment just like idealizing like the Indian art scene. Like now I think I know better, because like it's, it has similar problems, maybe a bit more extreme, especially with class and casteism. But yeah, I was like idealizing like what would it have been like to be like, to remain in India like past 10 years and just like practice there, and like, come into community with people who looked like me, who were interested in like similar sort of aesthetics. Yeah, but there is like a gap, something missing that, yeah, it's difficult to sort of, recapture.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it is a difficult kind of situation to navigate, and I feel like it's a privilege to be able to move through those worlds as well. And I'm gonna kind of touch on that too with when I explain my new project as well. But if you'll allow me, I'm going to go back to the text because I have one more excerpt that I wanted to touch on. And maybe I'll give people a few minutes to think about. So something that, again, relating to this idea of, I guess, cultural policy that he touches on is this statement where he talks about this kind of cradle to coffin scenario, and that this is both an advantage and a weakness of like Canadian cultural production, that you have this ability to, and actually maybe Nora, it would be interesting to hear your perspective as a curator too, because this idea that as artists, you know, you create work where you're applying for grants from a state body organization. And so therefore you're trying to write about it in a certain language that appeals to the state. And then hopefully if you get the grant, then you will make the work and then you'll show it in an artist-run center that will give you hopefully a fee and a speaker fee. And then, you know, if you're really lucky, the work might get acquired by the national sort of collecting body and this kind of thing. But then he talks about how this waters down the position of curators and critics and how there's no good curators in Canada. So I wanted, I guess, maybe, I'll ask Nora maybe if you want to respond to that, and anyone else to think about. So this is something that I'm thinking about a lot these days, because I also mentioned I just got rejected from a grant today, so I was a little sad about that. and for a project that I'm going to talk to you about afterwards. And I've had a lot of success in a lot of my work, and I do owe a lot to a lot of state organizations. And I think that's one thing I think about as well, is when I'm making work, like I think some of the past work that I showed you very briefly is more palatable for a state organization or a governing body. And it's very, it's attractive because I'm talking about, you know, Canadian values or migration or things like, these are things that the state wants me to talk about. But when I make work that can be sticky or controversial, I have trouble getting funding for those kind of projects. So I'm thinking about that a lot, and how I frame my work and the language that I use to also speak about and write about my work too. So yeah, I also kind of wanted to touch on this quote as well. So yeah, Nor, any responses? Are there any good critics in Canada?
Well, I think, yeah, it seems like art criticism in Canada is growing a lot more, maybe like in the last 5 years, also because I'm paying more attention to it now. But yeah, I don't know if I want to respond to your question now, because like we have so many curators in the group. So maybe we could hear from folks.
Sure. Anybody want to chime in?
I just wanted to mention that I think this passage is interesting in relation to the history of the Art Gallery, and also Ken Lum's role in the history of the Art Gallery, where it was sort of set up as and run by artists for a long time, so that artists could act in curatorial capacities without the need to defer to other institutions or other curators or whatever, like it was an artist to artist relationship. And I always kind of interpreted that as that being very sort of like defiant and utopian sort of a gesture. So to hear him sort of spin it in a slightly less positive way and say that that's actually been detrimental to the development of curatorial practice in Canada is really interesting to hear him reflect on it in that other way.
But do you think he's right?
I don't know. I've only been in Canada for the last 10 years and I've only been a curator for the last 3, so I couldn't really say. I just think it's just illuminating to hear that he might be reflecting on this sort of DIY art movement in a negative way, or in like thinking about what that eclipses, as well as what it creates.
Yeah, I think, I mean, he might also be reflecting on it because, I mean, I don't know if at the point of him writing this, if he was already living in the States, but he worked in the States. He did some time living in New York, I think, prior to this too. So he might be comparing it to that as well. But I mean, I guess, again, I'm thinking about like, I'm very grateful to be in the position that I am, being an artist in Canada. But I guess reading this makes me acknowledge, and thinking about, you know, everything else he's saying in the text, acknowledge the position of like justifying my work and research to the national body and how that forms what I make. And I'm very aware of the maybe like limitations that that puts on practices as well. And I don't know about if any, you know, artists and, you know, people working in this way, if that's something that's come up, or if you've thought about when articulating your works, when you're applying for a grant, how to kind of make it appeal to that body. Does that limit us? Does that, yeah, put, obviously it does put parameters on what we make. I don't, well, maybe it does, at least in the way we articulate it, but maybe not in practicality, but it's something I'm curious about.
I was just thinking about this passage in relation to the other text that you shared, the something's missing text. And on page 159, Ken Lum talks about his work on other projects in contemporary art. So like writing projects, but also curatorial projects in like Africa and like in lots of different places. And I'm just thinking about the way in which he talks about in this passage, the artist being like the curator and the critic and the collector at the same time. And then that he's like in some way also fulfilling that role, and then talks about that role as a part of his artistic practice. I think I'm like, I hope I'm not misquoting it. But I think he talks about it as like a part of his artistic practice. And then like, I don't know, I think about myself as someone who occupies a similar position as like an artist and cultural worker. I don't know if I like the word curator, but that it is like almost like a part of your practice. And I think because of the similar kind of way in which state funding and like support of the arts works, that is still possible. So it's like a little bit of a paradox when you read the other text.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he does talk about that as a, you know, being an extension of his practice. And I think he also speaks about it in relation to wanting to kind of create community as well, if I'm not, if I'm remembering that correctly. Yeah, so I can see how it can be, yeah, it's a paradox, but I guess, yeah, I'm not being very articulate, but I guess it's just that I wanted to consider this passage in the way that we, yeah, produce. And I don't know if you think about it in the way that you're also maybe when you're working in different spaces and producing for institutions as well.
Yeah, I mean, paradox might be a bit of a strong word. Like maybe it's like inconsistent or something, but yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like I really have an answer to that. I think that working on like curatorial projects or like projects within institutions that are outside of my cultural background, or like where I'm working with folks who have different kind of political concerns, is still relevant to my practice. But I'm like trying to figure out how that ties back to like this like question about I don't know, Canadian arts funding and its like relationship to the weaknesses of like I don't know, weak curators or whatever he's trying to say.
We have some hands, so I'm not sure who was first, but maybe I'll ask Eliza if you want to speak.
Hi, yeah. I don't know what exactly I want to say, but I guess I'm thinking about I guess I'm an artist first and foremost, but I do lots of things and I teach and I have curated some things. I think sometimes I've turned to curating because I want to see something happen that I don't see happening. Sometimes I've turned to it because I just need to survive.
Mhm.
And survival as an artist is like difficult for many of us. Um, and the ways in which like the funding bodies, just to speak to that, the way we have to kind of temper language. And I guess I keep thinking about language through this whole talk.
Mhm.
You know, multiculturalism like has always been a term I feel really critical of, but it also seemed to like offer space for my family to like practice our culture in some ways that I didn't see like across the border in the
Mhm.
States, like with family that was there. But then it's an externally constructed idea that then you're trying to fit yourself into so you can survive. And I guess I'm wondering about this, you know, weak curators or whatever, that Canada's producing weak curators. But I just think about like how our institutions are structured and who has access to positions of power and decision making, and you know, like yeah, that's persistent. um, So it's not just like granting bodies, but it's also the artist representers, it's also the institutions like that you're trying to figure out how to um, spin your work.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah, and it does come back to language in a lot of those ways, which is, yeah, the theme of my talk, I guess. I didn't really realize till I started, but definitely. So we have a couple more hands. Pamela?
Yeah, Elise just pretty much said what I was going to say. I think for me, it's the work. I'm always trying to increase my awareness around who has access and who has privilege. When we think through curatorial roles, I myself, similar to what Elise just shared, was, you know, often people think that I actually had this desired will to curate, and I didn't. I had a desired will to be an artist.
Yeah.
That was not what the universe offered me.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always these conundrums where I need to be part of the game in a city like Toronto and the cultural landscape. And I just always kept it in my heart that there would be reciprocity. And there wasn't. So it wasn't like I actually, you know, willed that. It was a certain kind of like disassociation I would make. But I kept going through the projects because also there was so many Indigenous, Black, and racialized artists that never got opportunities. So I became this artist organizer / curator, artist, or, you know, and this was a time when my peer curators in the city did not like the fact that, you know, there was they liked collective shows, but these ad hoc artist curators, who do they think they are, kind of thing. And I think in larger cities, you see a lot more artists organizing and artists curating. But having lived in New York and coming back here, I really wanted to make a dent in Toronto for community, by community, and being a founding member of SAVAC too. But the thing is that what Ken is privileged, right? He's working in Philadelphia University and he's chair of the grad faculty in that way. So and I'm not smack talking this is the truth. And folks who can, you know, who gets to actually experience that level of post-secondary mentorship and facilitation and guidance. Not a lot of people in Canada, right? Particularly if we're looking at non-mainstream identities. And what I mean by that is like, you know, neurodivergent people, disabled people, trans artists, of course, racialized artists, Black artists, Indigenous artists, right? And then another thing is like, I love this resurgence of artist activity and artist collectivity that are saying, you know what, F you. This is your hegemonic system. We didn't build it. So we're gonna build our own collectives now. Mm-hmm. Angry Agent, Feminist Scan, Black Artists Union, you know, we're seeing it. The Black Curators Forum, you know, like we have what, 50 years of collective activity from members of the Black artists, cultural producers community that have not at all made a dent in Canadian art history. Why? That is a huge oversight. And then every, like, Indigenous communities, like, right? Like, it's like we've been overlooked by the system that wasn't even made by us, right? So I think we need to, you know, I mean, Ken's lucky. He's super, you know, like he has all these, you know, he's touched upon all these different sectors of the art system, collectors, institutional collections, private collections, you know, even his own entrepreneurship with running his own restaurant in Vancouver. So it's like, how many of us can actually speak to that? Not a lot, right? Also coming from, he's someone of the Vancouver School, right? And then I think you didn't highlight this, but he mentions Dennis Reed's history of like painting in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. That was the only text, my friends. We still have a lot of work to do where we fit into art history, right? You know, but guess what? It's not critics and his, like, the historian, the critics that make it. It's us, the artists, that make art history. Mm-hmm. That's our job. We're doing the work, right? And if you look to the South, like someone like Faith Ringgold will say, or, you know, any of the elders in the African-American arts community, like members of the community, the Kawinga workshop, photography workshop, the system never, ever acknowledged them. They had to build their own systems and then transverse, right? That's where I think intersectionality works. And that's like, you know, I mean, like what, I have like I'm not boasting here, but like 4 or 5 talks lined up in the next 3 months, only like, you know, led and facilitated by people who have like degrees from Yale or Bard, or, you know, it's like, come on, people, do something. Mm-hmm. You've got the big old, you know, you got those amazing, like, you know, Ivy League curatorial degrees, and yet you still look to us to come in and fix things. You know what I'm saying? To pick my brain. I'm not being remunerated to pick my brain. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. There was another,
all
actually,
that in a bag of chips.
There was a part of the book actually that I found really interesting. There was one of his kind of personal essays that Ken put in there, and there was it talks about around the same time there was a protest at the VEG about how they wanted to have more artists of color at the VEG, and he says, he writes this from like a third-hand account. Somebody else said, they're like, we want more POC at the VEG, and then they're like, the curator is like, well, we just had a Ken Lum and Stan Delagus exhibition, and they're like, we don't consider them people of color anymore. That the person says that they don't consider Ken Lum and Stan Delagus people of color anymore, and he's like, I heard that secondhand, and that was really awkward. And it is I found that really interesting because it's a very slippery, I mean, it is really awkward, and I totally understand with everything you're saying, and he is a very privileged person now, but he did start, I think, from humble beginnings, you know.
Absolutely, and I'm not denying that, right? But that's what I'm saying. We're still all struggling in the humble beginnings stage, right?
Right.
also like look at someone like it's
the
like
same
I'm
thing.
thinking of something like the the memorial he's done or the public sculpture he's done for Kamagata Maru. It's like Ken got to do that, not anyone of South Asian descent.
Right, yeah.
Right. And then often, I just fielded a call from a curator slash consultant who's looking for like people who make public sculpture, BIPOC people who make public sculpture, right? Why can't I find any Black artists who make public sculpture? It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not here to like school you on the gaps now. And what are you not learning? I understand I'm privileged as a curator. I'm like, oh man, I did not sign up for this, but that's the kind of calls you have to feel through as members of Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities where they don't see us. They're starting to wonder, where are we, right?
Right.
It's like, well, of course, you're only looking to people who are tenured faculty. You don't really see who's there doing the sessional work. So it's like, you're only going to get those few voices at the table, right? But you know what? I say break the table. Like, let's just move aside like 5 feet and make our own table, which you are doing very well. So I think you guys, your generation's doing that. Like I look to a different generation who's still not at the table. They're still forgotten, so I feel my job is to bring them into the room, and then you guys can have a conversation. Sorry, I'm taking up too much space, but I just wanted to say that I really do feel access and privilege are two things that I'm constantly thinking through week after week in these kind of forums, whether I'm publicly facing people or privately in meetings. And it's frustrating, but it's the work we have to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Pam. No, it's important.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks for putting it together.
Thank you for coming. Paul, if you want to chime in, and then I do have another little bit I wanted to look at.
I think Pamela kind of nailed it. I'm just gonna add like one little thing aside from that is for the idea of kind of these weak curators or whatever. I kind of wonder if there's something about brain drain happening, maybe, of like this idea that we have that Canada is like some kind of backwater, like we live in the sticks, and like any curator of note or any artist of note has to like move to the States or to England, or like they're big in Europe, like that's such a compliment. Like I'm big in Europe. There's this idea of you have to leave Canada to be really big, to be really of note. So maybe this idea of kind of like the artist as curator, or the artist as more than just an artist kind of thing, the artist as anything and everything, is kind of a survival tactic almost, not solely this idea of like a unique Canadian thing of that breeds weak curators or something. Because as soon as you're kind of note, you leave the scene. So we kind of have to fill the gaps left by these curators of note who leave, something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting too, because then if you think about like what he says in the beginning of this passage is like that you have the ability to, I guess that's kind of what he's saying is like the ability to be compensated for this work throughout the stage, but then you have to fit into the mold to be able to speak the language to get the money to appeal to the funding bodies. And if you don't, then you don't get that money, and then it's not possible, I guess. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as well with this work. Simran, do you want to say, and then I'm gonna.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's like been a long arc of this conversation, but I'm just thinking about, I feel like I've formulated my thoughts a little bit better, and I just wanted to say a couple of things. So the first thing I want to say is the Massey report that Ken Lum talks about in the beginning of the article is like a pretty outwardly racist report. And that's like the structural thing that the Canada Arts Council is built on. And also the fact that most of the people in Canada in director, curator, like leadership positions within Canadian arts institutions are people who are, who have like sought their degrees from American universities and have like education from these like big, large universities, like Pamela was saying. And that like maybe that's also part of the problem of like, you know, curators from Canada not having those opportunities, but also, sorry. The other thing I wanted to say was that like because of the Canada Arts Council kind of being built on white supremacy, there are certain ways in which we like expect these structural or like governmental agencies to operate, and those don't necessarily support the people who are like the least privileged. And like, even though the Canada Arts Council has made certain attempts to level the playing field for, you know, diverse curators and artists, there are only programs for Indigenous curators and artists, but there are no longstanding programs for Black or POC artists and curators, which like leads to a structural, sorry, I can't find the words, but like it's inequity, and also that, sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought while I'm saying this, but basically that like they've tried certain things like the Culturally Diverse Curators Fund that gave opportunities to culturally diverse curators, but then like never created substantial like opportunities for leadership or like moving into larger positions, which like sorry, like Sarah was saying, I think in the chat, like leads people to have these like really shitty experiences within arts organizations where it's like BIPOC and like otherwise diverse folks are like consistently just like held in these curatorial assistant positions or like, you know, install positions and then like looked down at because they hold these positions rather than leadership positions, which end up going to like the white American educated person.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that over and over, and it's super frustrating. I also wanted to mention I cannot see the chat because I have like too many things open. So I apologize if things are happening in the chat and I can't see it. I'm going to ask Noor to keep an eye on that for me. And if somebody says something that I should address, please.
Yeah, maybe if you could read both Sarah's and Abithar's comments.
Okay, maybe I'll have to stop sharing because I just have like too much stuff open. Should I address them now, or
I can read them
too?
Or you can mention it. Yeah. Yeah, you can read it.
Okay. So Sarah Nesbitt wrote, I also can't unmute easily, but if she wanted to jump in, she can also do that. Maybe partly because of how much they have to justify their work, have the ability to frame their practice and curate in a really dynamic way that ups the bar for everyone. However, I do see in bigger institutions, there is a lot of laziness and a lot of stealing work from underlings, artists, etc. So I think you have to be really precise about what part of the Canadian art milieu we are talking about, but for sure, I think artists are really important and strong curators in Canada.
Okay, it's a little bit quieter. Can I just quickly say something too? Okay, yeah, like I definitely have seen in big institutions just so much of, abusing artists and their intellectual labor, and also like hiring people, like we all said. But also I think all the work that, you know, folks like you, Pamela, have been doing all the years, and, you know, Alize, and also all these kind of like DIY artist spaces that pop up in bigger cities are like put a lot of pressure on bigger and lazier institutions and curators. And so I do think there's like a tension that is happening that creates some important things. But so anyway, just to say that like I do think artists keep curators growing, and there is so much strength in the artist curator community in So anyway, there's a lot of artists here that I respect. So just want to say thanks for pushing that forward. That's all. And thanks for this conversation. It's great. Zinnia, you're amazing. And Nora, you're awesome. Everyone's great. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. And was there another comment that you?
Yeah, and also Abidar, maybe you wanted to read it yourself, or I can also.
It's not that important. I just said that if I were to curate a show, I would be paid $2,500. But if I was in a group exhibition, I would probably be paid no more than $500. And I think that precarity is a huge part of it. So that the money given to artists doesn't even cover the cost of actually making the art unless they're lucky enough or in a position to be eligible for grants.
Right.
And the labor is just valued very differently. I've heard a lot of like grantors and like public art commissions and institutions with lots of money justifying really low artist fees because they say that the art is already made. And I think it puts people in a position to have to curate and have to curate poorly. But anyway, I think it's a huge, huge topic, but really enjoying the conversation.
No, it's true. Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point as well, is the different way that these two works are weighted. I guess it's interesting to think about, because for me, I feel like the two things are very separate, and personally I find it difficult to kind of change hats, so that's why I've never dove into curating. But it makes sense that it is out of, you know, necessity in terms of promoting the people around you and trying to, you know, activating the spaces and seeing what you want to see in terms of community, and then also financially, because they are weighted so differently in terms of labor, and that is really interesting to see. Yeah.
I have one more comment from Denise. Like, I think I would like to hear it from her, just because, yeah, it touches on a lot of things that we've also talked about.
Sure.
Denise, sorry.
I was trying to stay out of this conversation just because there's so many brilliant people here, and of course I didn't want to take up the space, but I mean,
take it up.
Yeah, just something that I've been, you know, dealing with recently. Oh, not recently, it's been, but this idea of mentorship and how that works, and how the funding bodies have, and this has been mentioned by other speakers, how the funding bodies have outlined what they think is an ideal mentorship program, and how how institutions create their own way of mentorship that doesn't acknowledge or accommodate the fact that there's not this line of continuity. So, you know, when there's recent art school grads, not necessarily younger, but recent art school grads and early career emerging would-be curators coming out, or artists who are thinking about getting into curating, or whatever the case might be. And, you know, they've had maybe BIPOC teachers, maybe not, but they would like to think about, especially curatorial, which is a lot about framing and context. Like it helps to think about, think through those things with someone that might have similar experiences. And so they're looking for a Black or BIPOC or curatorial mentor that might have, you know, more to offer in that way. And they look around, and the institutions don't have mid or late career BIPOC curators working there. I mean, they're only now thinking about maybe hiring someone after, you know, the summer. And so there's this discontinuity, and then those younger or recent grads or early career curators or artists are deciding to go to Toronto, where there's more visibility of people that they can work with. And then so it never changes in regions such as where I am now, in terms of the makeup, because there's always, you know, people that are like brilliant and ready, and then they're just not getting, you know, finding a way to access institutional knowledge that one would need to be a director curator. And you know, Simran Preet talked about this again, this like sort of ruptured pipeline that isn't there for others. And then so it's more straightforward to go from art school to curating to an institution. And I'm just, I'm trying to do my best, like be available to mentor young professionals here, but it just means that I have to take on
more labor,
a lot of that labor when, my peer organizations or other galleries should be hiring curators to be those sorts of models. And there's definitely talented curators that could be hired and they're not getting hired. And this is the issue. So it's more than one. It's not just the funders, it's the funders and the institutions and the educational art education institutions. Like they all have to, get on board with this and not pass the buck. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these are conversations a lot of people are having in a lot of spaces, but it's kind of like, I think, it comes back to labor and and the people, it's exhausting the amount of also like, this idea of like looking to artists to change that situation, but it's also kind of like we can't depend on these people who are underpaid to fix these problems also. It's kind of like, we can't all be looking at the Pamelas and be like, oh yeah, Pamela, well, where you been for 30 years? It's like even now, like, I'm sure that's really frustrating to like, just think about kind of like mentorship. And I think we're like, maybe these are some things that are like, hopefully starting to inch towards change again, but it is exhausting for the people like yourself who are there currently. And
Zinnia, I just want to add, Denise, I'm curious as to your sorry, I just have a reflective comment around your time in Europe and what we're seeing that's going on right now at the Guggenheim, let's say.
Oh, you mean like all of these new hires and
yeah, well, that was messy, right?
I don't know too much about the Guggenheim. You'll have to let me know about that. I mean, I just saw an announcement about Antoine Sargent.
Yeah. Go.
Oh no, so that's Gagosian. Sorry, Guggenheim was Naomi Beckwith, right?
That's right, Beckwith.
Yeah, okay.
but they did not give any provenance to the contracted curator for the Basquiat show, and then Nancy Spector held a public program without even inviting her.
Yeah.
And she just left. Nancy Spector just left like a couple of months ago now.
Yeah.
I'm also
but what was your question, Kamala?
Well, the question, I think what I'm saying, I'm reflecting on what you're saying around bigger institutions doing doing their work, lifting, right?
Yeah.
And just in reflection to how is it going on in Europe, like your time in Europe versus like what you are now situated in Vancouver, let's say, and how you're also commenting around the spectrum of ASOs or artist rent centers or public galleries and bigger museums. And then what recently just happened at the Guggenheim. So it's like, there's bad blood, right? And then they brought in Naomi. And they're talking about, they're using a language of healing and care, which is like, really? You pretty much, like the woman, sorry, I forget her name, but she claimed, I think they had to get an outside organization in order to investigate, but she claimed racism and the outside organization didn't find any evidence to that.
I'm also wondering, sorry, just because we're a bit over time and I wanted to just like
when were we ending? 5 o'clock?
Well, we didn't really say, but we're originally thinking it was an hour, but we're already like 45 over. But Nor, did you want to say something? I'm going to go into speaking a little bit more about in relation to the show and Glissant, if that's
okay. Well, you know what, Denise, I'll talk to you later about it.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Yeah,
no worries.
But I guess this is all really wonderful, and I know this is all on the top of everyone's mind, and so I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I'm just trying to think about I guess one last thing I wanted to touch on in relation to the text and in relation to something missing, and thinking about vocabulary. So as well, sort of, Lum is talking a bit about, he mentions a little bit of Fanon, and you know, something that kind of stuck out to me is like thinking about this absence of nation, the idea of having an absence of nation leading to the emancipation of culture. For me, like I relate this to thinking about, again, the way I'm speaking about and framing my work. If I wasn't constantly framing my work for a national body or in relation to the idea of multiculturalism or other, would I still be making the same work? Probably not, because that's what I'm thinking about a lot of the time. And it's a kind of, it's loaded because that's also now what my research is about. But I also kind of begrudge it in a certain way. So there's that. But he talks about in Something Missing, you know, and he talks about in many other essays, this idea of teaching in Martinique, and he talks about the situation with his students, and he talks about his students in Martinique not having the tools to critique their own position of being colonial subjects. But for me, it's again really about vocabulary, and this is kind of when I wanted to circle back on this idea of vocabulary, because it reminded me of this moment when I was in France a few years ago, and I had a friend of mine who was French, and she had a roommate who was from Martinique or Guadeloupe, and she was trying to explain to me about, because I had never heard of these islands before, and I didn't know what they were, and so she was like, well, so it's like part of France, but it's in the Caribbean. And I was like, well, so it's a colony. And she was like, well, no, it's not a colony because it's part of France. And I was like, well, it's not part of France because it's in the Caribbean. So, and it reminded me again about this use of language, because for her, a French person, you know, she wouldn't use the word colony because it's a negative connotation. But that's what it is, essentially. And, you know, colonialism is alive and well, especially, and very clear in these places that are still governed by France. But they won't use that word, and they'll change the vocabulary to make it seem more palatable, more acceptable, maybe to the larger French population. So I wanted to throw it back to Noor, because that's a big part of what you're thinking about in relation to this exhibition with Glissant.
Yeah, with Glissant, and it was also so lovely to have, like, you know, Fanon's mention in the Something is Missing essay, just because, like, looking at like Fanon's life. One second. But looking at Fanon's life, you know, Fanon moving from Martinique to Algeria to, you know, do that solidarity work across different communities and cultures, like it, yeah, like it's not necessarily like, you know, you know, the removal of the nation will let culture thrive, but it's really the sense of like cultures thriving that I think we're getting at, which is really exciting. And yeah, I also wanted to talk to you about like the section where Ken Lam talks about art world, or art as something missing. Art world is something missing. Like I felt like I kept coming back to it, because I think also like what we're talking about in language here with multiculturalism, it's also like, you know, it's not necessarily the word to use about where we want to get to, but it's kind of like a placeholder for now. And like Abidar talked about, it's not necessarily like state-sponsored multiculturalism that we need, but a more Creole sort of vision. And that's something that's missing. So yeah, I think those sort of notes in these texts were really exciting for me, because they just kind of like came as like flashes that just remind me of like, you know, the connections that we do share between different communities. Missing language. But yeah, so I just wanted to pipe in about that. But yeah, the exhibition is about, you know, discovering like past links between different between different positions and locations, but also trying to forge new ones, which I think Ken Lum was also actively doing through his practice. So yeah, it was a really exciting text to read for this session. And yeah, thank you for taking us through it, Zinnia.
Thanks. Yeah,
Very
thanks
good
for joining,
noises.
everybody. Yeah, I guess how are we feeling for time? I was gonna show a little bit of work in progress, but I don't know if we have time for that. Should I do that, or I can kind of just wrap up? How do we feel?
I think we can go through with it.
Let's go to like 2 hours, and so like another 10-15 minutes. Like,
okay. All right, so I will show you guys some stuff, and then maybe you can let me know what you think too, and relate it back always. So I'm thinking about, I guess, this idea of language, and then also structuring, I kind of touched on the topics of first and third worlds, and like thinking about how placing my practice in the position of, I don't know, sometimes I'm very preoccupied with this idea of kind of like self-othering as well. And so I wanted to show you guys a little bit. Well, I'm going to describe something that I'm working on, and I guess the script, so this is a film that I'm working on currently, and the script for this will be actually featured in the gallery as well. So this is a still from a video that I shot in Pakistan in 2014 when I made my other film, Sea View. So again, I've always been very sort of preoccupied with this idea of class struggle and dynamic, and how that shows up visually in different places. And I have this like very visceral memory of like reacting when I made my first trip to Pakistan when I was around 5 years old, and seeing the visible poverty, as a lot of people might know if you've ever been to South Asia. It's a very like just seeing the mass population, and then seeing sort of all of this visible poverty in the streets. And for me as a young kid, I remember like kind of being very taken aback by that. And I guess I spoke about earlier about how that was actually something that I was super ashamed of. And I guess also like growing up post 9/11 and feeling lots of insecurity about that. And this is something I wanted to kind of tackle in my work, and also think about when it comes to in relation to the home and domestic space. So when I was in Pakistan in 2014, I came across this scene that happened between my aunt and her maid. So that was a domestic worker working in her home, in which the maid, so this scene I filmed, my aunt is sitting on the couch, and her maid is asking her for help because she had had something stolen from her, from a family member, and she's obviously very upset. And my aunt looks like she's, not very sympathetic. She looks like she doesn't give a shit in the scene. But what is kind of happening here, which we don't really know, is that the maid was actually lying to my aunt, and she ended up going on and stealing something from my aunt. And my aunt is kind of aware that this is happening in the scene, but from the outside perspective, we obviously don't know that. And I tried to make work about this when I was much younger, and I've ever since this happened, I've been very preoccupied with this footage because it's very uncomfortable to watch and to look at. But I guess what also is kind of the other position that you don't see in the footage is myself as the camera holder, and also the person who has the privilege of leaving the situation, and the person who has the privilege of coming back here and not having to deal with this in my day-to-day, and spending time to actually think about this situation because I'm not living it all of the time. So for me, this kind of really articulated this idea of class privilege, and this kind of visible understanding of like first and third world. So I'm just gonna show you like some things I've been looking at in terms of research. I've been reading this book called The Theater of the Oppressed by Augusto Boal, in which he talks about different, he's a Brazilian theater practitioner, and uses the theater as a means of understanding and promoting social change through different sort of reenactments with non-actors and things like that. also the work of Karen Mirza and Brad Butler, and their experimental films in which they're understanding sort of the different positions of the filmmaker and camera person, and they like the position that they hold. And this film, I also wanted to point out Noor for you too, because it's by a Norwegian filmmaker called Anne Hortgertu, called Time Passes. And it's a film in which this young girl who's doing her MFA named Demla, she, as a performance piece, she spends time with this Roma woman, and she sits outside with her and begs for money with her. And this is her performance art, and her classmates are trying to tell her that this is inappropriate and this is not respectful. And she insists that it is respectful, and she, you know, forms a friendship with this woman. So these are the things I've been thinking about for the past couple of years in relation to this work. And I've made a script for this work in the past, and I've held readings, which I've asked people to read different parts of the characters, between my aunt Farzana and myself, as well as a character. But now I'm kind of in the position where I have now decided to translate this situation to North America. So I'm going to be creating a film that is now, it'll be the same situation between a woman and her domestic worker, but within a suburban context here in North America, because I'm thinking a bit about, I guess, all of this stuff that's happened recently with COVID and things like that, and more of my just kind of research and realization, what I've been struggling to kind of articulate with this work is like thinking about my position as the filmmaker and the camera person, this position of being able to leave a place. And what I've struggled with showing this work in North American context is that, you know, this, I think for people who are of South Asian descent, it seemed like something that happens very much over there, but this doesn't happen here. We don't have these kind of domestic class struggles here, but we know obviously that that's not true. So I want to kind of bring it into this context more and more, so that I guess that becomes more clear. So yeah, so I just kind of wanted to share that with you all, because this is what I've been researching for the past few years, and hopefully going to be working on soon when I can shoot again. Yeah, so I guess we were also talking about, I've been watching a lot of Downton Abbey in relation to this work, because this was also when I watched Downton Abbey for the first time, I was realizing as well that these kind of like, as much as in like India and Pakistan, obviously there's a history of caste system, but there's also, you know, British imperialism, and there was a very, you know, structured class dynamic as well that was inherited through that. And I kind of didn't really realize that until I started watching the show, of how intrinsic that was. So I'm thinking about all these things when I'm making this new work. Yeah.
So you were looking at the vertical mosaic as well, right? Like if you wanted to briefly talk about how that comes in.
I mean, I was thinking about that again in relation to kind of the first quote that I showed, with thinking about how the French and English, French and English nationalities in Canada are seen as the most, are kind of like the pivotal nationalities. And again, when we talk about multiculturalism, it's every other culture is kind of compared to those culture, to the French and English culture as well.
Because my book is still, I think, somewhere in transit. So yeah, I thought it was also to do with class. So yeah, I'm really excited to read the text in the coming weeks as well. And hopefully I get my hands on it before my curatorial talk.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that what we've touched on today is probably more relevant to that as well. So I'll actually skip to, I was gonna go into some of this, but I was like, these are kind of some of the closing thoughts that I wanted to end on. These questions that I've been thinking about, of would you feel more free in what we were able to make, if not weighted with the task of confronting identity and nationhood with cultural work, and how does this translate into the way you speak about or justify cultural production, which again kind of brings back to the quote that we were talking about, the cradle to coffin scenario as well, with Lum. So these were some of the thoughts that I wanted to end on. Yeah. So that's pretty much it for me today. Sorry, I feel like we went kind of all over the place, but I think it was very generative. And I'm sure a lot of the comments are going to stick with you and continue on with the further series of talks that we're going to be having. So if anyone has any questions, maybe I'll stop sharing now. We can just chat. And yeah.
Great question.
Also send us the questions by email, sorry, just because they do feel very weighty.
Yeah.
Like I want to chew on that question. Like,
oh, sure.
A couple of those for a while. And thank you for sharing your work.
Yeah, feel free to also let me know if anything was unclear or seemed crazy, because I'm like working through it right now. So I know that was super brief, but I just wanted to be.
I had a question about the work, Zinnia.
Sure.
I'm wondering how you're working with kind of like the negative associations or tropes that can be associated with domestic workers, especially when it's revealed that she's lying.
Mm-hmm. How am I working with the negative associations?
Yeah.
Well, I guess how do you mean exactly?
Does it, I'm trying to find out the best way to articulate this, but like, does it kind of reify the trope of like the low wage worker as like deceitful or dishonest in some way?
I mean, I guess that's going to come through with the way that it's acted, right? As I think what I'm trying to articulate more in this situation is the way that the two people are actually dependent on one another when they're not able to depend on social structures to be able to kind of survive in this situation. So the woman, the domestic worker also in this space, is undocumented. And she's kind of dependent on her employer or the generosity of her employer to be able to be okay. So I hope it doesn't come across that way, but I think it's going to come through with the acting. Like I think, well, the way that I envision it is that the person will have sympathy from the get-go for the domestic worker. I guess obviously we can't control the way that people interpret the scene, but I'm trying to kind of highlight the way the two are kind of dependent on one another.
Thanks.
Nora, do you have any thoughts you want to?
Yeah, I think like, being from India, actually one of my friends from Winnipeg also unpacked this relationship between, domestic worker and like the family, but they recreated the scene in, sorry about my dog. But they recreated the scene in like Midwest America, I think, as like a residency that was filmed. So they performed as a domestic worker for this white artist for a week, and like they recorded what like the interactions were like. And it's just so interesting how people and bodies just sort of like slip into these social roles, really like without much tension sometimes. So I think it's going to be interesting to like really sit with the tension and unpack that a little bit through your work.
Yeah, please send me their name and in whatever, if there's anything like that online. I'd love to see it. But yeah, I can, yeah, Elise, let me pop those questions. I can also show it again if you guys want to talk about this, but let me just put them in the chat, the questions, and we can go back to, yeah, I'm sorry there was like, I guess I picked a lot of stuff to talk about today, but I guess that's not bad either.
It's a good problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
And maybe like I could just like respond very briefly to the first question. Because yeah, I'm aware of the time as well. And we could have like email threads, hopefully, to keep the conversation going. But yeah, I think like in doing this exhibition and curating it and like doing it in different ways, I'm also interested in like this language of identity, not necessarily nationhood, I think yet. I still have a few weeks to get there, but like how do you get away from these like very like rigid identity politics that like can't like art agencies and like just like the public sort of impose on you, and how do you find a different way to talk about the position of your left foot, the position of like your arm, and how do you find a way to relate to other people's bodies and like movements. So yeah, I think like this language is also really difficult to work with and to talk about really complex desires and histories with. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, I mean, like this is something I think about a lot, and it's also kind of the crux of my work in a lot of ways. And if I wasn't pushed up against this barrier, then I would not be talking about it. And maybe that's, it's worth talking about too. So it's also kind of, we're kind of formed by our containers as well. And it is also just the like reality of working and the way that we work. So, but I guess I was thinking about too, just like, what if we were able to get rid of those constructs, then how would we be speaking about our work?
I forget what the artist is, but like 20, 30 years ago, she responded to somebody asking like, why are we still having like Black exhibitions? Like, let's like not segregate artwork and stuff. But like Adrian Piper, actually, yeah. So like her response to this person was like, what was it? It is because of the pigeonholing gaze that we continue to work in this container, or something to do with gaze. I use it like for every article, so I'm just gonna just get it for everybody. Oh, if they pigeonhole us, no, I'm gonna be back, right?
Sure. There's the baby. Hi, baby. Yes. So cute.
So if there are pigeonholes, it's because the viewers who see them are already predisposed to pigeonhole us. And I feel like it's still so relevant, like 30 years down the line, that, when you're talking about, oh, baby.
Baby.
And when you're talking about, like, is this the work you wanted to make, when you started out, or is that the work they sort of expected you to make? It's a really interesting question as well. But yeah, so lots to talk about and chew on, but I'm wondering if we can also close this conversation and maybe, sit with the questions that came up today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Or Gallery, for hosting us, and Noor. Yeah, I hope some of this was generative thought, and I will come back to it later on. Actually, hopefully, like, I don't know if the chat was recorded, but that might be useful too for you to have, Noor. So yeah. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Zinnia. Thanks, Noor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.